Right now, there is a nation in the middle of Europe that is losing 3 citizens for every single one that is born.
Yeah. 3 deaths for every 1 birth.
It is just basic math, but the birth rate has crashed to 0.9. Think about that for a second.
Right, because to keep a population totally stable, you need a birth rate of 2.1.
Yeah, so at 0.9, a society is in demographic freefall. I mean, even if the fighting stopped this afternoon, even if all the treaties were signed and the borders were secured, that nation is still bleeding out.
The people who are supposed to rebuild it are either gone or they're just never going to be born.
Oh, welcome to Reformed Thinking. Today is Monday, April 20th, 2026. And our mission for today's deep dive is to analyze a massive stack of sources detailing what policy experts are calling the Refugee Trilemma.
Which is the reality resulting from the Ukraine-Russia war, a conflict that is now sitting in its 5th year.
Right. So we are going to look at the secular policy data, the hard economic numbers, and we are going to evaluate all of it through a theological framework.
We really want to understand what happens to a society when the basic building blocks of human life are just scattered across a continent.
And the numbers we pulled from the source material are staggering. We are looking at 10.8 million people who currently require direct humanitarian assistance.
Wow.
Yeah, and there are nearly 6 million refugees scattered across the European continent.
The sheer scale of those numbers, it forces us to look past the daily news cycle. When you hear about 6 million people displaced, it is very easy to abstract that into a logistical problem.
Oh, absolutely.
You read the policy papers and the language is very sterile. But what we are looking at is a total rupture of human life. The trilemma we are analyzing today is the agonizing choice facing these millions of individuals and the governments hosting them.
Right, so let's outline that. You have 3 competing poles.
First, you have return, the idea of going back to a war-torn homeland to rebuild it from the ground up.
Okay, what is the second?
Second, you have integration. That is the choice to put down permanent roots, to learn a new language, and build a life in a host society.
And then the third one.
Third, you have demographic recovery. And that is the desperate existential need to repopulate a dying nation.
So the problem here is that these 3 goals are actively fighting each other.
Spot on. If you pull on one thread to solve one problem, the other 2 just start to unravel.
Right, because if a family integrates successfully in Germany, they are not returning to rebuild Kyiv.
No, they are not.
And if they do not return, the demographic recovery of the nation fails. But, if you force them to return before it is safe, you are putting human lives at incredible risk.
Which brings us to the theological framing from our sources. The central idea here is that a crisis of this magnitude is not just a failure of international diplomacy,
Right.
or a gap in humanitarian logistics. We are watching the outworking of human depravity on the part of the aggressor, and simultaneously the mysterious outworking of divine providence.
This is a modern-day exile. And for you listening right now, it forces a very uncomfortable question about where true security actually resides in a fallen world.
It really does. The peace offered by secular institutions, whether that is a European directive or a temporary ceasefire, is often just a temporary pause in visible violence.
It is a cessation of hostilities, but not actual restoration.
Yeah. So to understand the policy decisions that are currently being debated in European parliaments, we first have to establish the physical and legal reality of the people living inside this crisis.
We really have to look at the anatomy of this modern exile. Let us lay out the historical context on the ground. Since February 2022, the sources report over 500,000 Ukrainian casualties.
500,000 lives, lost or severely broken.
It is hard to even picture. Furthermore, 13% of the entire housing stock in the country is gone. It is totally decimated.
To put that into perspective, imagine taking a major Western country and systematically flattening more than 1 out of every 10 houses, apartment buildings, and civilian structures.
Entire cities. Places like Mariupol and Bakhmut have been physically hollowed out. And when we say hollowed out, we mean the municipal infrastructure is completely erased.
The water treatment plants.
Right. The electrical substations, the schools, the hospitals, they're reduced to rubble.
And that physical destruction creates an immediate legal and social reality right across the border. Because when the physical structure of a city ceases to exist, the citizens of that city require a legal structure to catch them when they fall.
Yeah, that makes sense. Eurostat, which is the statistical office of the European Union, reports that there are 4.40 million people currently living under temporary protection in the EU.
That is a massive demographic shift.
And you look at the map, And the highest per capita concentrations of these refugees are in places like Czechia, Poland, and Slovakia. And the European Commission just extended the Temporary Protection Directive, or the TPD, until March 2027.
We should probably explain how that directive actually functions for the listener.
Yeah, the TPD is basically an emergency mechanism. It was designed to provide immediate protection in the event of a mass influx of displaced persons.
So it bypasses the traditional asylum system.
Exactly. The traditional system is slow and requires all these individual case reviews. Instead, the TPD grants blanket rights. The right to reside, the right to access the labor market, medical assistance, and education for children.
But the key word in that directive is temporary. It is a legal patch. It is not a citizenship pathway. And this is where the theological parallel from our sources provides us a brilliant lens for understanding the psychological state of these 4.40 million people.
Right. The text draws a direct line to the biblical book of Jeremiah, specifically chapter 29.
Yes. The refugees of 2026 are living in a state of liminality.
Liminality, so a transitional space.
Yeah, it is a survival state where you are caught between what was and what will be. You are basically standing in the doorway.
Like the ancient Israelites who were exiled to Babylon.
Spot on. They were physically safe from the siege. They were living in the Babylonian Empire, but they were entirely displaced from the land of the covenant.
Okay, let's unpack this for a second. Think about what that TPD extension actually feels like for a family. It is like living in an airport departure lounge for 5 straight years.
Oh, that is a great analogy.
Right. You are legally safe, you have a plastic chair to sleep on, the climate control works, and nobody is dropping bombs on the airport. But you cannot build a house next to gate B14.
No, you cannot plant a garden on the concourse.
And you cannot board a flight back to where you came from because the runway at your destination is covered in craters. So you are just waiting. You are existing in a state of suspended animation, waiting for an announcer to tell you what your future holds.
And that state of suspended animation is what the prophet Jeremiah addresses. The sources highlight the structural arrangement of that biblical text. It uses a command ground structure.
Meaning what, practically?
Well, the text does not just offer vague comfort. It delivers a direct command from God, followed by the ground, or the theological reason for that command. And the reason is stunning. God addresses this exile directly. And he does not frame the exile as a triumph of Babylonian military strategy. He frames it as an act of his own sovereign hand. Yahweh says, "The exiles whom I have sent into exile."
Wow, that changes the entire calculation.
It really does. It shifts the focus from human geopolitical maneuvering to a divine decree. God follows this by saying, "I know the plans I have for you."
It is a declaration of sovereign grace standing over a situation that looks, from a human perspective, completely hopeless. But
Yes.
hold on, I need to push back on that application. It is one thing for us to sit here in a comfortable studio and talk about how God used the Babylonian Empire for his sovereign purposes thousands of years ago.
Sure.
But if you are a refugee who just watched your apartment building in Mariupol collapse, burying your neighbors, how do you reconcile divine providence with that sheer scale of modern wartime destruction?
It is heavy.
500,000 casualties, cities wiped off the map. Applying a divine decree to that level of human suffering sounds cold. Doesn't that feel incredibly hollow to someone living through it?
It is the hardest question any believer can ask. Reformed theology approaches this by holding two truths in tension without diminishing either one. You have the doctrine of providence and the reality of human responsibility.
Okay, so they exist side by side.
Right. The wickedness of an invading army is entirely real. The moral guilt belongs completely to the aggressors, and divine justice will address that guilt. Yet, at the exact same time, God governs all of human history.
Even the catastrophic stuff.
Yes, he uses even the catastrophic, wicked actions of empires to accomplish his sovereign purposes. For the ancient Israelites, the destruction of Jerusalem and the flattening of the temple was the dismantling of their earthly idols.
Because they had placed their ultimate security in a physical building.
Yeah, in a building, in geographic borders, and in their status as a geopolitical entity. They assumed God was bound to the temple stones. The modern parallel is really arresting.
The sources suggest that providence often involves the dismantling of our earthly securities, our bank accounts, our passports, our stable careers, our suburban comforts. All of it is stripped away to radically sharpen our focus on his eternal kingdom.
Yes, that stripping away is painful, but purposeful.
So sitting in that airport departure lounge under the Temporary Protection Directive is not just a bureaucratic holding pattern. It is a spiritual trial.
It is a stripping away of everything that gave you the illusion of control.
But if staying in that lounge forever is unsustainable, because the directive will eventually expire, the natural instinct is to want to leave the airport. You want to go back. You want your home back.
Of course.
But returning is fraught with massive physical and economic barriers. Which brings us to the first pole of the trilemma, return.
The desire to return is powerful, but the actual mechanics of a national return are incredibly difficult to execute.
Right, because the World Bank put out a recovery assessment for 2026, and they make one thing very clear. People are central to reconstruction.
You cannot rebuild a nation using drones and automated cranes.
No, you need human beings. You need tax-paying citizens, construction workers, teachers, and business owners.
Sure.
However, when you look at the OECD reporting, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, which tracks these global economic trends, their data shows the return intentions of displaced people are tied almost entirely to basic survival metrics.
What do the numbers say?
35% of displaced people say a well-paid job would persuade them to go back. 40% point to a higher standard of living as the deciding factor.
And you really cannot blame them. Return is currently hindered by things that are hard to comprehend until you look at the details. We are talking about uneven security, heavily mined agricultural land, and highly fragile energy systems.
Let's talk about the mechanics of those barriers. When you talk about heavily mined agricultural land, you are talking about the disruption of a primary economic engine.
Because Ukraine is historically a global breadbasket.
Right. So when millions of hectares of arable land are seeded with unexploded ordnance, returning to your farm is a lethal gamble.
Demining is a slow, methodical, incredibly expensive process. You cannot just buy a tractor and start plowing.
The sources mention that the insurance premiums alone for agricultural equipment in those zones make farming economically unviable for an individual family.
And then you have the energy grid. A modern society cannot function if the power goes out every 4 hours.
Think about what a fragile energy system means in the dead of winter. A post-war winter grid is not just an inconvenience where your lights flicker. It means the municipal water pumps fail, so you have no running water. It means the district heating systems shut down, so the radiators in your apartment freeze and crack. You cannot operate a school, let alone a hospital, under those conditions.
This brings us back to the biblical text. We find the mandate of messianic hope in Jeremiah 29, verses 10 through 14.
What does that mandate tell us?
Well, the emotional and spiritual pull of home. The longing for familiar streets, for family, for a stable community. That is a legitimate God-given desire. God promises the exiles a future and a hope, and eventually, a return.
However, from a strict policy perspective today, pushing for a mass return without first fixing the power grid or clearing the landmines is highly problematic.
It really is. It forces individual households to shoulder the massive cost of national recovery entirely on their own backs.
So what does this all mean? You are asking a family with small children to act as the shock absorbers for a broken national economy.
Yes. Return must be linked to reintegration. You cannot just put people on a train, drop them into a city without a functioning power grid, hand them a shovel, and call it a successful recovery policy.
Right. There must be capital investment, job creation, and municipal restoration.
And the loss of those physical homes forces a recalibration of where a person's hope actually resides.
I want to raise attention here for the listener. Imagine you are a refugee mother currently living in Warsaw. You have your kids enrolled in a Polish school. They are safe. The electricity works. There are no air raid sirens.
The moral weight of this choice is crushing.
Is it selfish for that mother to prioritize a higher standard of living and physical safety in Europe over a patriotic return to rebuild her devastated country? Or is she simply engaging in rational, faithful provision for her family?
That tension is the core of the moral dilemma. We cannot reduce this to simple slogans. A mother securing safety and education for her children is fulfilling a primary, God-given vocation to care for her family.
It is the exercise of wisdom in a broken world.
It is. The danger arises on two fronts. On one side, policymakers might use patriotic guilt to pressure individuals into unsafe situations before the infrastructure is ready.
And on the other side,
an individual might completely abandon their covenantal ties to their homeland, their culture, and their church community solely for the sake of Western consumer comfort. The Reformed view of vocation means weighing all of our responsibilities to our immediate family, to our neighbors, and to our nation.
Because immediate return is completely impossible for so many families due to those landmines and broken power grids we just discussed, refugees are forced into a new reality. They have to build lives where they are currently standing.
Yes.
Which brings us to the second pole of our trilemma, integration.
The concept of waiting has to be redefined. If you cannot return, sitting in the departure lounge indefinitely destroys the human spirit.
So let us look at the 2026 UNHCR analysis. The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees gives us a clear picture of what integration looks like on the ground. 57% of Ukrainian refugees in Europe are currently employed.
Which on a spreadsheet looks like a massive policy success. Over half the adult population has found a job.
But the next statistic reveals the hidden rot in that success. 60% of those employed people are working significantly below their skill level.
Yeah, that is a huge issue.
We are looking at a highly educated population, people with advanced university degrees, medical licenses, engineering backgrounds, and they are holding low-skilled minimum wage positions.
The mechanical difficulty of integrating high-level professionals across borders is severe. You have massive childcare bottlenecks, which disproportionately affect refugee populations who are mostly women and children.
Right.
But the biggest hurdle is credential recognition.
Let us walk through the reality of that. Why is credential recognition so legally complicated? I mean, if you are a pediatric surgeon from Kiev who relocates to Munich, why can't you just walk into a German hospital and start operating?
Because the European Union has incredibly strict regulatory frameworks. A medical licensing board in Germany has to verify the curriculum of the medical school in Ukraine.
That sounds like a lot of paperwork.
It is. They have to assess liability laws, malpractice insurance requirements, and specific procedural standards. On top of that, you have the sheer cliff face of language acquisition.
Oh, right. A surgeon must be able to communicate perfectly with the anesthesiologist and the nursing staff in German. Any misunderstanding could be fatal.
Exactly. The bureaucratic friction involved in translating a career from one nation to another takes years.
Here's where it gets really interesting. It is like using a master architect to build sandcastles. They are technically working, but their true capacity is sidelined, which hurts both them and the community. You have a brain surgeon stocking shelves in a grocery store while the host country complains about a shortage of medical staff.
And the biblical framework addresses this exact dynamic. Our sources direct us to the mandate of mediation found in Jeremiah 29:7.
The command to seek the welfare of the city.
Yes. The command given to the exiles in Babylon was counterintuitive. God said, "Seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its welfare you will find your welfare."
Seek the welfare of the city that holds you captive. That is a hard pill to swallow.
What's fascinating here is the text unpacks the Hebrew word used for seek. The word is darash. It denotes an intensive, diligent pursuit.
So it is not passive compliance.
No, not at all. It is the same word used in Scripture for seeking God himself.
Yeah.
Integration, under this mandate, is not just about economic survival. It is not just about getting off the state welfare rolls so you can pay rent.
Right. It is a spiritual vocation. Refugees are called to act as kingdom priests in the cities where they find themselves, whether that is Warsaw, Berlin, or London.
And the Protestant view of work applies directly here. All honest labor is considered a calling from God.
Yeah. The Reformed perspective on vocation views our daily work as the primary mechanism for exercising our God-given gifts. We use those gifts for the shalom, the peace, prosperity, and flourishing of the host city.
So when 60% of a highly educated population is underemployed, driving forklifts instead of practicing medicine, that is a failure of vocation on a societal level.
Waiting passively for the war to end or working jobs that do not utilize your actual capacity actively destroys human capital.
It results in a lost decade for those individuals. They lose their professional edge, they lose their confidence, and the host society loses out on the actual expertise sitting right in front of them.
Integration is an active, diligent pursuit of the good of the city you are standing in, even if you do not plan to stay there for the rest of your life. You plant gardens, you build houses, you seek the welfare of the city.
But if host countries successfully integrate these master architects, if they get their medical licenses approved and their children become completely fluent in the local language, a new crisis emerges immediately.
The host countries want to keep them.
Yes. Which leads to the third pole, demographic recovery.
Let us look at those numbers again. Ukraine's birth rate has plummeted to 0.9. The death-to-birth ratio is 3-to-1. The nation is literally vanishing.
Meanwhile, you look at the European Parliamentary Research Service data from 2026, And they note that the EU is facing severe skills and labor shortages due to its own aging population.
Germany, Italy, and other major economies have massive gaps in their pension systems because they do not have enough young workers paying taxes to support their retiring generations.
We are looking at two massive demographic vacuums competing for the exact same human beings.
So how does the theology source address this?
The sources outline the mandate of multiplication from Jeremiah 29:6. The command of the exiles was to take wives, have sons and daughters, and multiply there, and do not decrease.
Maintaining the family line and refusing to decrease is an act of covenantal obedience.
Yes. The original creation mandate from Genesis, to be fruitful and multiply, is not suspended just because a war breaks out. The biological urge to have children and continue your family line is framed by the biblical text as an act of spiritual defiance against the destruction of war.
But the demographic reality creates a tension. Ukraine needs its people to survive as a nation, but Europe needs these exact same people to fill labor shortages in healthcare, logistics, and construction.
This raises an important question. It highlights the paradox of successful integration. When integration works, when children start learning Polish or German, when adults sign a 30-year mortgage for a house in Dresden,
Yeah.
when they establish credit histories and career momentum, return becomes highly disruptive. It becomes a second migration.
Right. For a child who has spent 5 years in a German school, returning to Ukraine requires uprooting your life, breaking your social ties, and starting over all over again.
Exactly.
Well, I have a pointed question to throw your way based on this. Does Europe's demographic need for labor cross a line into an extractive logic where host nations are quietly utilizing Ukraine's tragedy to solve their own aging population crisis?
Our sources highlight this as a central moral tension in international relations.
Hmm.
A purely extractive policy design would be highly controversial.
How would that look practically?
If European nations design legal frameworks that intentionally sever a refugee's ties to their homeland, making it legally impossible to maintain dual residency or transfer assets, just to prop up the local tax base.
That undermines the geopolitical solidarity they claim to offer.
Yes, refugees are not a reserve workforce to be harvested during a crisis. They are citizens of a sovereign nation.
So we have a dying nation that needs its people back to survive. We have a host continent that needs their labor to sustain its own economy. And in the middle, we have millions of individuals who just want stability for their children.
The old binary model of immigration, where you either stay in the new country forever or you go back home permanently, is completely failing under the weight of this reality.
With Ukraine bleeding population and Europe absorbing it, the old stay or go binary is failing. The sources point to a new way of handling this reality. We have to move past the idea that physical location dictates total allegiance.
The solution requires moving from a one-way settlement model to a mobility model, or what some call circular migration.
And the sources outline several very practical policy mechanisms to make this happen. Things like portable pensions, digital record interoperability, fast-track credential recognition, remote public services, and summer return programs for youth.
We should look at how those mechanisms actually work, because they represent a fundamental shift in how nations interact with human capital.
Let us take portable pensions as an example. How does a portable pension work between the EU and a non-EU nation like Ukraine?
Well, it requires bilateral agreements. Normally, if you work in Germany for 5 years, you pay into the German pension system. If you leave Germany, accessing that money from abroad is a bureaucratic nightmare, and you might lose years of contributions.
Which penalizes you for going home.
Right. A portable pension agreement means the governments integrate their tax data. The 5 years you work in Berlin count toward your retirement in Kyiv. The capital moves with the worker.
It removes the financial penalty for returning home. What about digital record interoperability?
Ukraine has highly advanced digital public services, like their Dia app, which holds digital passports, tax IDs, and property deeds. Interoperability means the Polish government recognizes the digital medical records or educational degrees authenticated by the Ukrainian government's app.
So the friction of proving who you are and what you are qualified to do is eliminated through secure digital handshakes between governments.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this policy shift aligns with the central idea of the text from our Jeremiah passage. God-ordained exile requires rejecting both isolationism and assimilation.
You do not wall yourself off in a cultural ghetto, refusing to interact with the host city, but you also do not completely erase your distinct identity and forget your ties to your homeland.
Right. A software engineer in Prague or a doctor in Berlin can still contribute massive value to the reconstruction of Ukraine without physically living there.
Through financial remittances, targeted business investments, and temporary returns to consult or train others.
Yes, provided the legal institutions allow for flexibility rather than bureaucratic rupture.
Applying what Reformed theologians call the third use of the law, this calls for a life of grateful obedience. The believer is called to seek the good of the host nation while still prioritizing the demographic survival of the covenant community.
It creates a dual horizon. You live fully engaged in the city where you reside, but you keep a pathway open to your home.
Let us provide an example to make this concrete for the listener. Imagine a Ukrainian nurse. Instead of forcing her to choose between losing her medical license in Germany or returning to a destroyed clinic in Kiev, portable credentials change the game.
They really do.
She can work in the EU, send money home, and eventually transition back to a rebuilt Ukrainian health system without losing her career progress.
That requires an enormous amount of institutional flexibility from European governments. They have to design tax codes and labor laws that expect people to move back and forth seamlessly.
It is a delicate balance, but as we reach the end of our analysis, we have to look at where the theological source material lands. The secular data gives us the mechanics of the crisis, but it does not offer an ultimate resolution.
This is where the Christological anchor becomes vital. The entire trilemma points directly to Jesus Christ, the ultimate refugee who fled to Egypt to escape Herod's tyranny, sanctifying the path of the displaced.
He knows what it is to be hunted, to leave your home behind, and to live as an outsider.
The sources present a summary of Christ's roles. He is the prophet speaking peace, the priest interceding for the 10.8 million in need, and the king who will gather the exiles.
So the return of the refugee, integration of the sojourner, and recovery of the nation are all subservient to the restoration of the soul in Christ.
Without that anchor, the situation is just a sociological tragedy.
Which brings the focus squarely back to you, the listener. The secular fatalism of war and the reliance on things like the EU's Temporary Protection Directive offer only an illusion of safety. A piece of paper from a government cannot secure your soul.
True home and eternal protection are found only in Christ.
And so we leave you with a final thought to mull over. Since true home and eternal protection are found only in Christ, how does your own attachment to the safety of your bank account, your passport, or your career mirror the very earthly idols God might be dismantling in the background of this modern exile?
Where does your security actually lie when the structures around you fail?
Something to consider as we watch the mechanics of this modern exile unfold. Until next time.